His advice to a female relation who was contemplating marriage speaks volumes. Listen to this, George Washington on marriage. Experience will convince you that there is no truth more certain than that all our enjoyments fall short of our expectations. And to none does it apply with more force than to the gratification of our passions. There is sadness distilled in those words, along with wisdom. Bleak as it may sound, Washington's assessment of the most basic human desire, to love and to be loved, tells us a great deal about what was missing in his life. But it also suggests the cold-blooded realism that made him impervious to the political passions of his day. Today, he strikes many of us as literally too good to be true. The poet Robert Frost knew better. George Washington, wrote Frost, was one of the few in the whole history of the world who was not carried away by power. No action of Washington's did more to shape the presidency than his voluntary relinquishment of power at the end of 2 terms, a self-denying measure formally incorporated in the Constitution by Republicans who were dancing on Franklin Roosevelt's grave in 1951. Such renunciation led George III, otherwise no admirer of his erstwhile subject, to call Washington the greatest man on earth. On the morning of March 4, 1797, George Washington donned his best black velvet suit and walked to Congress Hall. For his final act as president, he would dispense with coaches, prancing horses, and flanking postilions. Not so the president-elect, who arrived for his inauguration resplendent in a pearl-colored suit of native broadcloth set off by a dress sword and cockaded hat. However foolish these martial touches appeared on squat John Adams, they were unavoidable in a nation too young to have traditions unsanctified by Washington. Adams knew that this inaugural day would be illuminated by the setting, not the rising sun. Wherever he looked, the new president beheld streaming eyes. At one point, the president-elect covered his own face to disguise a flood of tears. Nor was Washington immune to the intense emotions surrounding the historic transfer about to take place. It was probably just as well that he was not called upon to speak during the brief ceremony. The inaugural address, the new president waddled up the aisle and out of the hall. Ex-President Washington motioned for Vice President Jefferson to follow, but the tall Virginian in his blue frock coat held back out of deference. Washington repeated the gesture, a bit more forcefully, and then the vice president reluctantly preceded him to the door. Outside, a large crowd cheered Washington, slowing his progress down Chestnut Street. A few, however, rejoiced at his departure. Unrepentant to the last, the Philadelphia Aurora proclaimed, quote, "Every heart ought to beat high with exultation that the name of Washington from this day ceases to give a currency to political iniquity and to legalize corruption." Washington declined to engage his nemesis in public debate. Privately, he confided to a friend, quote, "This man," referring to the editor of the Aurora, "this man has celebrity in a certain way, for his calumnies are to be exceeded only by his impudence, and both stand unrivaled." With his usual quiet competence, Tobias Lear saw to the packing of 97 boxes, 14 trunks, 43 casks, 13 packages, and 3 hampers for transport on the sloop Salem. Oh yes, and the tin shower bath went too. Lear would perform a still more personal service on a blank December night less than 3 years later, ministering to his friend as Washington lay dying at Mount Vernon from a lethally sore throat. By then, Washington had performed one of his greatest services to his country. In the autumn of 1798, the ex-president retreated to his study at Mount Vernon and scratched out a 28-page will, whose opening lines contained an unmistakable political testament. I, George Washington, of Mount Vernon, a citizen of the United States, and lately president of the same, not a citizen of Virginia, not as a Tidewater aristocrat or a Southerner, but as an American, Washington reasserted the nationalist creed to which he had devoted 40 years of his life. Like other thoughtful men, he had struggled to reconcile his ownership of human beings with his country's professed love of liberty. He had hoped that Virginia's legislature would take the decision out of his hands by providing for gradual emancipation of that state's slaves. The chances of such action, always faint, grew still more remote as the lawmakers in Richmond talked openly of defying federal authority. And so it was left to Washington himself to free his slaves on Martha's death, after making certain that the aged or sick among them would be fed and clothed by his heirs. He took an even more radical step in challenging his state's legal ban on educating Negroes, directing that all under the age of 25 should be taught to read and write, and, quote, in Washington words, brought up to some useful occupation. And I do hereby expressly forbid the sale or transportation out of the said Commonwealth of any slave I may die possessed of, under any pretense whatever. And then, as if to reinforce his determination, Washington added a clause ordering his executors to carry out these wishes, quote, religiously, without evasion, neglect, or delay. I'm often asked what was Washington's greatest accomplishment. And it's hard. There are so many. But I don't think it was winning the revolution, although if he hadn't done that, again, we wouldn't be here. Nor even his presidency, during which he almost never set a foot wrong. I think the ultimate greatness of Washington was he redefined the meaning of the word greatness. You stop and think, before Washington, to be great was to conquer one's enemy, to occupy his territory, to kill as many of his men and soldiers as it took to establish one's own sovereignty. Washington redefined greatness, not as accumulating power, but as dispersing power, as walking away from supreme authority. He did it once at the end of the Revolution. He did it again at the end of the presidency. And he transformed this country as a result. On his deathbed, on a windswept spit called St. Helena, Napoleon said to no one in particular, they wanted me to be another Washington. But of course, that was not possible. Washington is one of those extraordinary, almost unique figures in history, of whom it can be said that concede his humanity and you confirm his heroism. Thank you very much.